Somewhere in the room, a window is open. The air that moves through it is cool against the back of your hand. Not cold, just cool enough to notice, and then to stop noticing. The way the body releases things when it is ready to rest. There is nothing you need to do with this. Nothing you need to follow or remember or hold. Somewhere very far from here, across a darkness that is mostly water, there is a city on a peninsula where two seas meet. It has been standing for a very long time. Its walls are old. Its bells have marked these same late hours for 1,000 years, ringing across the Bosphorus and going quiet again, the way bells do when the night has nothing more it needs measuring. The city is resting now. It has earned the rest. Let the breath slow. Let the hand on the sheet grow heavy. The night is long and the story is long, and there is no need to arrive anywhere before morning. The bells have gone quiet. The water moves against the old stone. The empire begins. Chapter 1: The City and the Horn. The city's name was Constantinople, or, to begin more precisely, it was called that by the people who built it, and by most of the people who came after, for the better part of 11 centuries. It sat on a triangular peninsula where the Bosphorus Strait meets the Sea of Marmara and the long, narrow inlet of water the city's inhabitants called the Golden Horn. 3 sides of that triangle were water. One side faced the European mainland, and it was on that landward side that the famous walls were eventually built, walls that would be tested, besieged, held, and finally, after 1,000 years, breached. The geography was deliberate. The man who chose it understood what he was doing. In the year 330 of the Common Era, the Roman Emperor Constantine dedicated his new city on the site of the older Greek settlement of Byzantium, a place that had existed for centuries as a reasonably prosperous port town, without any particular claim to greatness. Constantine transformed it. He brought architects, administrators, vast quantities of marble stripped from older cities, columns and statues, and the physical memory of the empire's grandeur, and he laid them down on this peninsula and called the result a new Rome. Not a replacement, not yet, not in his own mind, but a second capital, a city equal to the first, positioned closer to the empire's eastern wealth and closer to the frontiers that most needed defending. The older Rome had been growing harder to defend. Its traditions were deep, and its senators powerful, and its symbolic weight enormous. But the actual business of running an empire, paying soldiers, supplying frontiers, moving armies, benefited from a capital positioned further east. Constantine had spent decades moving between campaign seasons and temporary courts. The new city would solve the problem of geography. He was baptized a Christian on his deathbed, though for most of his reign he had carefully balanced the old Roman religious traditions with his evident interest in the new faith. What he built, however, was already Christian in its bones, not a city of temples to Jupiter and Mars, though some older structures remained, but a city that would quickly fill with churches, with the smell of incense in high stone rooms, with the administrative machinery of a faith that was rapidly learning how to run things. The city he built did not yet know what it would become. The century still ahead of it would change everything about what an empire meant, what a religion meant, and what it meant to sit between east and west on a triangle of land with water on 3 sides. Before any of that could happen, however, the city simply needed to exist. And in the hours before dawn, in those earliest years when the stone was still new and the mortar still settling, the Golden Horn lay quiet in the darkness, and the water moved against the pilings with the slow patience of something that had been doing this for a very long time and expected to continue. The bells that would come later, the church bells, the monastery bells, the deep tolling that would one day define the city's hours, had not yet been hung. The morning arrived in silence. The city waited. Chapter 2. The 4th Century. Constantine died in 337, having ruled for over 30 years, having built his city, having convened at Nicaea 12 years before the dedication of Constantinople, the first great council of the Christian Church, a gathering of bishops from across the empire who argued with considerable heat over the precise nature of Christ's relationship to God the Father. The council produced a creed. It also produced a losing side, and the losing side did not simply accept its loss, and the argument that Nicaea was supposed to settle would continue in various forms for another century and more. This is the nature of theological disputes. They are never entirely over. They go underground, they resurface, they change their vocabulary without changing their underlying shape, and they have a particular tendency to become political exactly when the political situation is already complicated. Constantine left the empire to his 3 sons. This was, in retrospect, a decision of the kind that looks reasonable from the inside and catastrophic from the outside. The sons fought. 2 of them died in the fighting. The third, Constantius II, ruled alone from 353 until his death in 361, long enough to demonstrate that holding an empire together required something more than outlasting one's brothers, and that theological preference, exercised by an emperor with strong views, had a way of making bishops very uncomfortable. The 60 years after Constantine's death were not quiet years. They were years of dynasties barely holding, of generals who became emperors and emperors who became cautionary examples, of the empire's frontiers pressing in from several directions at once. The Sassanid Persians to the east, a sophisticated, well-organized empire with their own long memory and their own territorial ambitions, required constant attention along a frontier that had been contested for centuries and would be contested for centuries more. The Rhine and Danube frontiers in the west and north were in a state of managed tension with the Gothic and Germanic peoples who pressed against them, not always hostilely, sometimes as settlers and soldiers rather than enemies, but requiring management of a kind that consumed administrative energy and military resources in quantities the empire's books found increasingly difficult to balance. There was a brief, strange interlude. Julian, called the Apostate by the Christian sources that survived him, ruled from 361 to 363 and attempted to restore the old Roman religious traditions, to pull back the Church's rapidly accumulating influence over public life, to return to something he believed was more authentically Roman. He was a capable soldier and an interesting thinker, and he died on campaign against the Persians at the age of 31, which ended the experiment. He was the last non-Christian emperor the empire would have. After him, the question was not whether the empire would be Christian, but which kind of Christian it would be, and how firmly the emperor's personal theology would be pressed onto the Church's hierarchy, and how the Church's hierarchy would press back. In a newly consecrated basilica somewhere in the city's expanding districts, the air held the residue of incense, frankincense, thick and sweet, not yet dispersed by the hours that had passed since the morning's ceremony. The stone was still cold at the base of the walls, where the morning light had not yet reached, though the upper portions of the nave caught a pale warmth through high windows, the kind of light that arrives cautiously in new rooms, testing how far it may go. The building was not quite finished. Along one of the side aisles, 2 workmen were doing something with a section of flooring, laying tile or relaying it, the work quiet and methodical, the sound of it a soft, irregular tapping that did not carry far in the stone interior. One of them said something to the other responded without looking up. Their voices were too low to understand from any distance, which made them feel less like voices and more like part of the building, sounds the stone was making as it settled into its purpose. The incense continued slowly outward from the altar end of the space. It reached the middle of the nave and kept going, fainter with each foot of air it crossed. By the time it reached the great doors, propped open now on the morning, it was nearly gone, only a suggestion, caught perhaps by someone passing on the street outside who would not have been able to say what they had briefly smelled, only that the air near the building had something in it that the street air did not. The workmen worked on. The light shifted by degrees. In an hour the incense would be entirely gone, and the building would smell of stone and new mortar, and the particular clean dryness of a space that has not yet accumulated enough human habitation to have a history. It was accumulating one now. These were the first hours of many thousands of hours, and the building did not know that, and did not need to. Theodosius I arrived at the throne in 379, summoned from Spain, where he had been living in a kind of honorable retirement following his father's execution on disputed charges, to deal with a crisis that the preceding emperor had created and then died in. The Goths, settled inside the Danube frontier some years earlier following pressure from the Huns from the east, had risen in revolt. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 had killed the Emperor Valens and something close to a third of the Eastern Roman army, one of the most consequential military defeats in Roman history, not because it ended the empire, which it did not, but because it demonstrated that the frontier settlement model had broken down, that large armed groups living inside imperial territory with their own leadership and their own loyalty structures were not simply a management problem but a structural one. Theodosius managed the Goths. He could not expel them. There were too many, too well armed, and the army was too depleted. Instead, he negotiated a settlement that allowed Gothic groups to remain inside imperial territory as foederati, allied soldiers who fought for Rome under their own commanders, under treaty rather than as subjects. It was a workable solution to an immediate problem. It was also a significant shift in what the empire was and how it was held together, a shift that would matter enormously to the western half over the following decades. Theodosius also settled the theological question that Julian had tried to undo and that Constantine's sons had variously muddled. In 380, he issued an edict declaring Nicene Christianity, the version of Christian doctrine affirmed at Nicaea in 325, to be the empire's official religion. Not merely the emperor's personal faith, not merely one permitted religion among several, the religion of the Roman state. Other forms of Christian practice were heresy. The old Roman religious traditions were not exactly banned, not at first, but they were being steadily cornered, their temples increasingly closed or converted, their public presence diminished. By the end of Theodosius's reign, the old ways had largely retreated from the public life of the cities, surviving in the countryside. The word pagan itself derived from the Latin for rural person, for someone still doing things the old way in the places where the new way had not yet fully arrived. In 391, Theodosius banned pagan sacrifice entirely. In 393, the Olympic Games, held since 776 BCE, 11 centuries of unbroken athletic and religious observance, were held for the last time. He died in 395 in Milan at the age of 48. Before he died, he divided the empire between his two sons, Arcadius in the east, Honorius in the west. He almost certainly intended this as an administrative arrangement rather than a permanent separation. The empire had been divided for administrative purposes before, and had reunified before. But Arcadius was 17, and Honorius was 10, and the men who surrounded them had interests of their own, and the western half of the empire had problems that were about to become much larger than administrative arrangements could address. The eastern half, Arcadius's inheritance, the half that included Constantinople, that included the wealthy cities of Anatolia and Egypt and Syria, that included the trade routes and the grain supply and the accumulated administrative sophistication of the older Greek East, held. It would go on holding through crises that would have ended a less resilient thing, for another 10.5 centuries. This is where the story properly begins. Not with Constantine, though Constantine built the city. Not with Nicaea, though Nicaea built the theology. But here, in 395, with the division that sent the Western story in one direction and the Eastern story in another, the Eastern story that is the one worth following, the one that leads through centuries of pressure and adaptation and occasional brilliance and frequent crisis toward a morning 1100 years later, when the sun came up over the Bosphorus and the city was still standing, as it had been standing for as long as anyone then alive had any reason to imagine it might not. The city was standing. The water moved against its stones. The bells, not yet hung in Constantine's day, but hung long since by 395, beginning to define the hours, fell silent after Vespers and left the night to itself. Chapter 3: The 6th Century and Its Ambitions. The 5th century passed over the Eastern Empire the way a heavy season passes, pressingly, with consequence, but without breaking what it pressed upon. The western half did not fare as well. Rome was sacked in 410 by Visigoths under Alaric, an event that sent a shockwave through the literate world. Augustine wrote a large portion of the City of God in response to it, arguing that the fate of earthly cities was not the measure of divine favor, and the Western Empire continued its long unraveling through the decades that followed, yielding territory, yielding authority, yielding the idea of itself, until in 476 the last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was quietly deposed by a Germanic general named Odoacer and sent to live in a villa in Campania, which he apparently did without significant complaint. The East watched. It managed its own frontiers, paid its own armies, navigated its own succession crises, and continued. It did not intervene in the West's collapse with any sustained force, though it maintained diplomatic relationships with the Germanic kingdoms that replaced Roman administration there. Theodoric's Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, in particular, was regarded from Constantinople as something between an ally and a subordinate, a useful buffer that spoke Latin and had grown up inside Roman administrative culture. This was the empire that Justinian inherited. He came to it sideways, as emperors often did. His uncle Justin had risen through the army to the throne in 518, an illiterate soldier of peasant origin from the Balkans who understood military command and very little else, and who relied heavily on his nephew, educated, sharp, restless, with an appetite for work that would characterize his entire reign, to manage the administrative burden of running things. When Justin died in 527, Justinian became emperor at the age of approximately 45, already familiar with the machinery of the state, already married, already certain about what he intended to do with the power he was acquiring. What he intended was considerable. The woman he married was Theodora, and she is one of the more remarkable figures in the long history of the Eastern Empire. Remarkable not merely because of what she did, but because of where she came from and how thoroughly she refused to be reduced to either category. The hostile sources, written partly during her lifetime and partly after, describe her early life in terms designed to discredit her: a performer's daughter, an actress and mime, a woman of the circus world that polite Byzantine society regarded with a mixture of fascination and contempt. The sources are not necessarily wrong about the facts. They are certainly partisan about what those facts mean. What is clear is that by the time Justinian made her his empress, which required him to change the law that prevented men of senatorial rank from marrying women of the theatrical profession, Theodora was a woman of considerable intelligence, considerable political instinct, and a toughness that had been acquired rather than inherited. She participated in governance in ways that went beyond ceremonial. She received ambassadors, corresponded with foreign rulers, maintained her own network of political relationships, and held theological views, sympathetic to the monophysite position that the Council of Chalcedon in 451 had declared heretical, that differed from Justinian's own, and that she defended with persistence and some success throughout their joint reign. She also, by most accounts, saved it. In January of 532, 5 years into Justinian's reign, the city came as close as it had ever come to ending the dynasty before it had properly begun. The trouble started in the Hippodrome. The Hippodrome was the great oval track that ran along the southern slope of the Palace District, seating perhaps 100,000 people, the social and political center of the city's public life in a way that has no easy modern equivalent. It was where chariot races happened, where public celebrations and public punishments happened, where the emperor appeared before his people and received their acclamation or their displeasure, where the city's competing loyalties made themselves visible and loud. Those loyalties were organized in the 6th century around the chariot racing factions, teams distinguished by color, of which the blues and the greens were by far the most significant. Their origins were practical. The colors identified which team of horses and drivers you were supporting. But over the preceding centuries, they had accumulated something far beyond sporting allegiance. They had become the organizational structure through which urban crowds expressed political opinion, theological position, civic grievance. To be a blue or a green in 6th century Constantinople was to belong to something, a neighborhood organization, a mutual aid network, a collective voice with established ways of making itself heard. In January of 532, both factions were simultaneously angry at Justinian's government, angry enough to do something that almost never happened. They set aside their rivalry and combined. The chant that went up from the Hippodrome, Nika, meaning conquer or win, the ordinary encouragement shouted at chariot races, became the name of what followed. The Nika riots lasted 5 days. The city burned. A significant portion of the older urban fabric, including an earlier version of the great church that would become Hagia Sophia, was destroyed. The rioters proclaimed a new emperor. Justinian, by several accounts, was preparing to flee by ship. Theodora, by the same accounts, told him that she would not leave. The precise words attributed to her vary by source, but the substance is consistent. The purple, meaning the imperial dignity, makes a fine burial shroud. She would not be seen fleeing from her throne. Justinian stayed. Belisarius, his greatest general, a man who had already distinguished himself on the Persian frontier and would spend much of the next 3 decades in the field on Justinian's behalf, moved troops into the Hippodrome where the rioters had gathered. When it was over, somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people were dead. The number is not certain. The riots were over. The city that emerged from the fires was rebuilt. Justinian built it differently and larger, and at the center of the rebuilding was the church. The construction of Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, took 5 years, from 532 to 537. The architects were Anthemios of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, mathematicians more than builders in the traditional sense, men who approached the problem of the dome not as craftsmen following established precedent but as geometers working out what physics would permit. What they produced was a structure that had not existed before and would not be surpassed in scale for nearly 1,000 years. Toward the end of the building, before the scaffolding came down, the interior smelled of wet plaster and cedar and the particular sharp smell of freshly cut stone. The scaffolding filled the nave in a complex wooden architecture of its own, platforms at various heights where workers moved with the careful economy of people doing precise work in uncomfortable positions. The sound when a section of scaffolding was struck, loosened, prepared for removal, was a sound that traveled through the stone of the building and arrived at other parts of it slightly changed, as if the building were already learning to conduct sound in the way it would conduct it for the centuries ahead. The dome, seen from below before the scaffolding cleared it, was not yet the golden interior that later descriptions would reach for. It was raw, pale, scaffolded still above the drum. It looked, from certain angles, like something in the process of becoming rather than something complete, which it was. When Justinian entered the finished church at its dedication in December of 537, he is said to have declared, though the words are reported at some remove, that he had surpassed Solomon. The claim was theological as much as architectural. He meant that the New Jerusalem had been built, that the Christian empire had produced something that outdid the temple, that the faith had found its house. Whether he said it in quite those terms is uncertain. That he believed something of the kind seems consistent with everything else about the man. The legal project ran alongside the building project and outlasted it. Within the first decade of Justinian's reign, a team of lawyers under the Juris Tribonian produced what is known collectively as the Corpus Juris Civilis, a systematic codification of Roman law stretching back through the centuries, organized, rationalized, stripped of contradiction as far as contradiction could be stripped from several hundred years of accumulated legal opinion. The digest alone ran to 50 volumes. The institutes served as a teaching text for law students. The code collected imperial edicts. The novels recorded Justinian's own new legislation. The corpus did not merely organize existing law, it preserved it through the centuries when the West was rebuilding from different materials, and when Roman legal tradition might otherwise have survived only in fragments. When medieval European universities began teaching law again, Bologna in the 11th century, followed by others, they taught it from Justinian's corpus. The legal vocabulary of much of modern Europe traces a line, through many transformations and reinterpretations, back to those 50 volumes and the years of work that produced them. Belisarius went to Africa in 533 with a force that historians have described as inadequate for the task and that nonetheless accomplished it with a speed that surprised everyone, including perhaps Belisarius. The Vandal kingdom of North Africa, established in Carthage since 429, a stable and prosperous state that had had several generations to become comfortable, fell within a year. Belisarius returned to Constantinople in triumph, bringing the Vandal king in chains, bringing treasure that had been sitting in Carthage since it was taken from Rome a century earlier. Justinian held a triumph in the old Roman style, the first in generations. Italy followed. It did not go as smoothly. The campaign in Italy began in 535 and did not effectively end until 554, nearly 2 decades during which Belisarius and then other generals ground their way up and then down and then up the peninsula again, besieging cities, losing them, recovering them, in a war that exhausted the Italian countryside, already weakened by decades of transition between Roman and Gothic administration, far beyond what the reconquest was worth in revenue or security. Rome changed hands multiple times. The city's population, which had been somewhere around 500,000 at its imperial height, was reduced by the end of the Gothic Wars to something that may have been as low as 30,000. The aqueducts were cut and not immediately repaired. The Senate, which had continued functioning in some form under Theodoric, was fatally weakened. The reconquest succeeded, in the narrow sense that Byzantine administration was restored to Italy. It did not succeed in the sense of producing a stable, self-sustaining Western province. Within 3 years of the campaign's end, the Lombards had crossed into northern Italy and began occupying the territory that Byzantine arms had just spent 20 years recovering. And then, in 541, the plague arrived. It came from Egypt, as plagues often did. Egypt being the great grain shipping hub, the place where ships from everywhere arrived and goods from everywhere changed hands, and, along with goods, whatever invisible passengers those goods carried. The disease spread along the shipping routes, arriving first in port cities, then moving inland, then moving everywhere. Constantinople lost, by some estimates, 1/4 to 1/3 of its population in the first outbreak. The empire lost a proportion of its people. Scholars disagree on the scale, but the disagreement is between catastrophic and somewhat less catastrophic rather than between catastrophic and manageable. Justinian himself contracted the plague and survived it, which was unusual. The army that was supposed to continue garrisoning the reconquered territories did not fully survive the plague's successive waves, which returned every decade or so through the remainder of the 6th century and into the 7th. The tax base that was supposed to pay for the reconquest did not survive it either. Justinian died in 565 at the age of approximately 83, having reigned for 38 years. The empire at his death was geographically the largest it would ever be again. North Africa, Italy, a strip of southern Spain, the Balkans, Anatolia, Egypt, Syria. It was also exhausted in a way that geography did not show and tax records did. The army was depleted, the treasury was strained. The reconquered territories required garrisons that the depleted army could barely staff. His successors would spend the next century discovering what that exhaustion meant. Along a road in Thrace, on a gray afternoon, a column of soldiers moved westward. Not quickly. The pace of infantry on a long march is the pace of the slowest man on the worst day. And this was not the first day of a long march. The road was Roman, well laid originally, showing its age in the stretches where the paving stones had shifted and the edges had crumbled into the verge. The column moved over it anyway because there was no other road. The sound of it was the sound of many feet at once, a rhythm that was not quite synchronized. Each man walking slightly differently, boots of different thicknesses, different repairs, producing something like rhythm without achieving it, a soft collective percussion that traveled ahead of the column in the form of felt vibration rather than heard sound. Dust rose around them in the still air and did not disperse quickly, hanging at ankle height for a moment before the next rank of feet stirred it again. At the edge of the column, a horse carried a man who was not walking. He was looking at the road ahead, not at the men beside him. The road ahead was the same road as the road behind. This far into a march, the landscape has a way of repeating itself regardless of how far you have come. The column crested a low rise, and for a moment the land ahead opened. A wide, shallow valley, fields gone to stubble, a village at the far edge too small to have a name that had traveled this far. The man on the horse looked at it without expression. The column began to descend. The dust rose. The sound of feet continued. The afternoon went on doing what it had been doing for some hours. Chapter 4. The Long Middle. Heraclius and the Arab Storm. The 7th century arrived at the Eastern Empire like a creditor who has been patient for a very long time and has finally decided that patience is no longer serving anyone. The empire that entered the 600s was still recognizably the empire that Justinian had built and the plague had hollowed. It held its shape. The walls of Constantinople stood. The administrative machinery continued to function, collecting taxes, issuing commands, recording transactions in the careful Greek that had replaced Latin as the language of governance sometime in the preceding century. A shift so gradual that no one issued a decree announcing it, the way no one issues a decree announcing that summer has become autumn. One season simply became another, and the documents that came out of the imperial chancery were in Greek, and the lawyers who argued before imperial courts argued in Greek, and the empire that called itself Roman was, in the language of its daily life, a Greek state. Its emperors in the first decades of the 7th century were not its finest. Phocas, who had seized the throne in 602 by leading a mutiny of Danubian troops, deposing and executing the previous emperor Maurice along with his sons, was by most accounts a man whose capabilities did not extend much beyond the violence that had brought him to power. He ruled for 8 years in a way that managed to alienate the church, the aristocracy, the people of Constantinople, and the armies on the frontier simultaneously, which is a kind of achievement, though not the desired kind. The Sassanid Persian Empire, watching from the east with the attentiveness of a neighbor who has been waiting for an opportunity, found its opportunity in Phocas. The Persians had been Rome's great rival for centuries, a sophisticated ancient civilization with its own imperial tradition, its own religion in Zoroastrianism, its own literary and administrative culture, governing from Ctesiphon on the Tigris, a state that stretched from the edges of Central Asia to the borders of Arabia. The two empires had fought across the same contested frontier for so long that the fighting had become a kind of structural feature of both states, expensive and inconclusive, punctuated by treaties that held for a generation and then frayed. Under Phocas, the Persians did not merely raid, they advanced with the intention of staying. Heraclius arrived in 610 from Carthage, where his father governed as the imperial exarch, sailing into the Golden Horn with a fleet and a claim to the throne and, if the sources can be trusted, an icon of the Virgin on his flagship's prow. He deposed and executed Phocas, which required very little popular resistance because Phocas had exhausted the population's tolerance for him some time earlier. Heraclius became emperor at the age of approximately 35 and immediately inherited a situation that had moved well past urgent into something closer to dire. The Persians were in Anatolia. By 614, they had taken Jerusalem, sacking it, carrying off the true cross, the relic that the Emperor Constantine's mother Helena had reportedly identified in the 4th century and that had since become the most sacred object in Christendom. By 619, they had taken Egypt. The empire had lost, within a decade, the holy city of its faith and the province that fed its cities. Heraclius spent the better part of a decade rebuilding the army, reorganizing the administration, negotiating with the church, which agreed to lend its treasure to fund the campaign, and preparing a counteroffensive that was, by any military standard, one of the more audacious operations in late antique history. He did not try to recover the frontier and push the Persians back step by step. He went around them. He took the war into the Persian heartland, campaigning in Azerbaijan, in Media, in the territories the Persians considered their own interior, forcing the Persian armies to turn from their western conquests and defend their own ground. The campaign lasted from 622 to 628. It was fought across a landscape of mountains and rivers and high plateaus, in seasons that ranged from Anatolian summer to the bone-deep cold of the Armenian highlands in winter. Heraclius led it personally, which was unusual for emperors of his era, and he led it effectively, which was unusual for anyone asked to fight across that terrain against a Persian army that had been winning for 2 decades. In 628, the Persian emperor Khosrow II was overthrown and killed by his own son, who then sought peace. The true cross was returned to Jerusalem in 630. Heraclius made the journey to restore it in person, entering the city on foot as a pilgrim, carrying the relic himself. It was the high point of his reign. It was also, almost immediately, the last high point the empire would experience for a very long time. The heat on the Anatolian plateau in high summer is not the heat of the coast, where the sea moderates everything, where the air moves and the light bounces off water, and even the worst July afternoon is broken by something. The plateau has no such mediation. It sits at altitude, high enough that the horizon is always visible, that the land extends in every direction without interruption, that the sky is enormous and very blue and offers no shade. The sun does not feel closer here, exactly, but it feels less filtered, less negotiated. It arrives directly as a fact rather than a suggestion. On a road crossing this country in the middle of such a summer, the heat settled on everything with an even, impersonal weight. The stones of the road held it and returned it upward. The scrub on either side of the road, whatever grew in this thin-soiled, water-scarce ground, was the particular gray-green of plants that have learned to hold moisture rather than display it. Nothing moved except the occasional lift of air that was not quite wind, that rose from the heated ground and carried dust a short distance before losing interest. A road like this does not disappear into the distance so much as it continues into it. The same width, the same surface, the same direction, until it becomes too small to see. Whether it ends somewhere specific or simply goes on until the eye gives up is not clear from here. It goes on. That is what roads across plateaus do. The light at noon had no angle to it. It came from directly above or near enough that shadows were very small and very close, crouched beneath the things that made them. The world was bright and still, and the heat pressed down with the patience of something that has all day and knows it. The news from Arabia arrived the way news from a great distance always arrives. Slowly, imprecisely, in fragments that required assembly before they made any kind of sense. What had happened in the years between roughly 610 and 632 was that a merchant from the city of Mecca named Muhammad had received, by his account, a series of divine revelations that he then recited to followers who memorized them and eventually compiled them into the text known as the Quran. The faith that gathered around these revelations, Islam, meaning roughly submission to the one God, had by the time of Muhammad's death in 632 unified most of the Arabian Peninsula under its banner. This was itself remarkable. The peninsula had been a landscape of tribal divisions and competing allegiances, and unifying it at all was a substantial political and military achievement. What followed was more than remarkable. It was one of the most rapid territorial expansions in recorded history. The Arab armies that moved north and west after 632 were motivated by faith and by something that faith sometimes produces in its early generations. A certainty that gives individual soldiers a relationship to violence and to death that organized professional armies find very difficult to match. They were also, more prosaically, experienced fighters from a culture that had been at war with itself and its neighbors for generations, now organized under a unified command for the first time. The empire they struck was exhausted. The Persian War had cost Heraclius everything he had, and winning it had not restored what the losing had consumed. The armies that had fought across the Armenian highlands were depleted and imperfectly resupplied. The provinces of Syria and Egypt, recently recovered from Persian occupation, had spent years under foreign administration, and their population's attachment to Constantinople was, in some places, attenuated. Syria fell with a swiftness that the surviving sources still convey with a quality of disbelief. The Battle of the Yarmouk in 636 was a decisive defeat for the Byzantine army, fought in August heat over several days, ending in a collapse that was as much about exhaustion and tactical failure as about the relative size of the forces. Damascus, already taken, was consolidated. Palestine followed. Jerusalem, which Heraclius had entered in triumph 6 years earlier carrying the true cross, fell to the Caliph Umar in 637, peacefully by negotiation, the city's Christian population and their churches protected under the terms of surrender. Egypt fell by 642. Alexandria, the second city of the empire, the great library city, the intellectual center of the Eastern Mediterranean for nearly 1,000 years, was surrendered after a siege. The grain that Egypt had been sending to Constantinople for centuries stopped coming. The tax revenue that Egypt had been generating stopped as well. The imperial budget had been strained under Justinian. It now faced a structural deficit that no amount of administrative reorganization could easily address. Heraclius died in 641, at the age of approximately 66, ill and, by the source's account, broken by what he had seen. He had spent 30 years building something back from the ruins of Phocas's reign and the Persian devastation, and in the last years of his life he watched the south and east of his restored empire peel away in a manner that his restored army could not prevent. He was not wrong to feel it as a catastrophe. It was one. There is a weapon whose exact nature has been argued about ever since, a weapon that appears in the sources in terms that are simultaneously specific about its effects and vague about its composition, a weapon that the empire deployed against the Arab fleet in the years 6072 to 6078, with results that were decisive enough to break what would otherwise have been a potentially fatal Arab siege of Constantinople by sea. It was called Greek fire. What it did is agreed upon. It burned on water. It could be projected from siphons mounted on ships. It adhered to whatever it touched and was extraordinarily difficult to extinguish. Arab accounts describe it with a quality that sits between description and awe. Fire that the sea itself could not put out. Fire that moved on the surface of the water as if the water were not there. What it was made of is not agreed upon, and the Byzantine state kept the composition secret with a diligence that has, over the following 14 centuries, defeated every attempt at reverse engineering. Petroleum naphtha from the Black Sea region is the most common component proposed. Quicklime and other substances that react violently with water have been suggested. The precise mixture, if there was a single mixture rather than a recipe that evolved over the centuries of its use, was a state secret of the highest order, known to a small number of people and never committed to the kind of written record that could be reliably intercepted. What can be said with confidence is that it worked. The Arab fleet that had been raiding the Marmara coastline and pressing the sea approaches to Constantinople withdrew after the 678 campaign and did not return in force for another generation. The city that had lost Egypt and Syria survived, in part because something burning on the surface of the water between two fleets could not be put out. The secret died eventually in the empire's later centuries when the ships that carried the siphons were no longer being built and the knowledge of how to fill them was no longer being passed down. By 1204, when the city finally fell for the first time, Greek fire appears in the sources as a remembered weapon rather than a deployed one. In the room where a monk sat at the end of an evening's work, the light was going. Not suddenly. Light at the end of a working day in a room with high windows goes gradually, the quality of it changing before the quantity does, losing its warmth first, then its direction, then finally its sufficiency. The parchment on the desk had been legible an hour ago without any artificial light. It was legible now with effort. In another quarter hour it would require the lamp. The monk turned a page, not to read it, but to note his place, to mark where the next day's work would begin. The sound of it was very small in the stone room, a whisper of one surface against another, the parchment stiff enough to have its own brief resistance before it settled. He placed a small strip of leather between the pages, a habit so old it was no longer a decision. He sat back, not for long. There were vespers to attend, and then the evening meal, and then the small and consistent architecture of a monastic evening that was the same this evening as it had been the evening before and would be the same tomorrow. But for this moment he sat, and the light continued its departure, and the room grew by degrees quieter in the way that rooms grow quiet when the light leaves them, as if darkness and silence arrive together as a pair. Outside, somewhere in the corridor, a door closed. The sound reached him through the stone wall, not as a sound exactly, but as a faint change in the air pressure of the room, a reminder that there were other rooms, other people, the rest of the building going about its own end of day. He rose. The lamp could wait until he returned. Chapter 5. What the Walls Kept. There is a particular quality to a city that has survived something it was not supposed to survive. It does not announce itself. It does not wear its survival as a decoration. It simply continues, the streets at their accustomed width, the markets in their accustomed places, the bells marking the same hours they have always marked, with a density of accumulated life that is only partly visible in any single moment, and only fully felt when you have been in the place long enough to understand how many layers of ordinary days have gone into making it what it is. Constantinople in the 8th century was such a city. It had lost Egypt and Syria and Palestine and most of North Africa. It had watched its provincial world contract until what remained was, by Justinian's measure, a torso without its limbs. Anatolia, Greece, a portion of the Balkans, some coastal territories in Italy and North Africa that would themselves not hold much longer. The city that had been the capital of a Mediterranean empire was now the capital of something more compact, more defensible, more Greek in character, and more Orthodox in organization. A state that had been forced by its losses to become more coherent in the things it still held. The walls held. That is the simplest way to say it. The Theodosian walls, built in the early 5th century, improved and repaired across the intervening generations, a double line of fortification with a moat on the exterior and towers at regular intervals, had not been successfully breached by any external force. The Arab sieges of the 670s had failed, partly because of Greek fire at sea, and partly because the walls on the landward side presented a problem that the Arab armies of that era could not solve with the siege technology available to them. A later Arab siege, in 700-718, failed as well, broken by a winter of extraordinary severity, by Bulgarian pressure on the Arab rear, and by the Byzantine navy's continued effective use of its incendiary weapon in the sea approaches. The city endured. Inside it, the 8th century produced a crisis of a different kind, a theological one, and theological crises in the Byzantine state had a way of becoming political crises and social crises and crises of identity all at once, because in a state where the church and the imperial government were this deeply intertwined, a dispute about the correct way to practice the faith was never merely about the correct way to practice the faith. In 726, the Emperor Leo III, the Isaurian, who had stabilized the empire militarily and seen off the Arab siege of 717-718, issued a decree ordering the removal of a prominent icon of Christ from above the Kalk Gate, the main ceremonial entrance to the imperial palace complex. The icon was taken down. The official who carried out the order was attacked and killed by a crowd that had gathered specifically to prevent the removal. The violence was suppressed. The removal proceeded. This was the beginning of iconoclasm, from the Greek for image breaking, and it was, in its way, one of the defining controversies of Byzantine civilization, a dispute that ran, with interruptions, for over a century and required 2 separate resolutions before it was finally settled. The theological question at its center was genuine, and it had been circulating in various forms for some time before Leo gave it imperial force. It asked, in essence, whether the veneration of images, icons of Christ, of the Virgin, of the saints, the painted and mosaic images that covered the walls and filled the devotional lives of Byzantine Christians, was a legitimate expression of faith or a form of idolatry. The prohibition on graven images in the Hebrew Scriptures was old and explicit. The question of whether a painted image of Christ constituted a graven image, or whether the incarnation of Christ in human form had changed the terms of that prohibition, was not a simple one, and serious theologians had taken it seriously for centuries. Leo's position was iconoclast. The images were idolatrous, they should be removed, and the church should be brought into conformity with this view. His son Constantine I pursued iconoclasm with considerably more force, convening a council in 754 that endorsed the iconoclast position, and presiding over a period in which monks who resisted the policy were persecuted. Icons were whitewashed or destroyed, and the theological argument was pursued by imperial decree rather than by persuasion. The resistance was substantial. It came primarily from the monasteries, institutions that had been accumulating spiritual authority for centuries and that were the heartland of icon veneration in the empire, and from the population of the city, for whom the icons were not abstractions but presences, objects of genuine devotional attachment, the faces of saints who interceded with God on behalf of ordinary people whose own prayers might not carry far enough on their own. The monk John of Damascus, writing from outside imperial territory, in Jerusalem, under Arab rule, which meant beyond the reach of imperial enforcement, produced the most systematic theological defense of icon veneration in this period, arguing that the incarnation of Christ in a human body had fundamentally changed the relationship between the invisible God and visible matter. That matter sanctified by that incarnation could appropriately be depicted and venerated. He was writing in exile, in safety, which is the condition under which a great deal of the most interesting Byzantine theology was produced. The night in a merchant's house in the city was a particular kind of quiet, not silent. The city was never entirely silent, even in the small hours, even in the centuries when its population was reduced from its Justinianic height. There was always something: a cart on the street below, the sound of someone's dog, the particular creak of a building adjusting to the night temperature, something indeterminate from the direction of the harbor. The sounds arrived through the walls at a remove, domesticated by distance. Stripped of their urgency, they were the sounds of a city continuing to exist, which was a form of reassurance even when no reassurance was being sought. The lamp in the room had been extinguished. Not long ago, the smell of the tallow was still present, the particular smell of a flame just ended, a combination of the oil it had burned and the specific quality of air that a recently living flame leaves behind it. The darkness was complete now, or as complete as darkness gets in a room that has a window, where the night outside is not entirely lightless. The linen of the bed had been warmed by the body in it and had taken on that warmth, held it, distributed it evenly in the way that good linen does, not the concentrated heat of one position, but a general warmth that extended a little past the edges of where the body currently rested, so that shifting position meant moving into warmth rather than cold. Outside, the city went on doing what it did in these hours. A door somewhere in the building or very close to it closed with the careful quietness of someone trying not to wake anyone. Footsteps receded. The city continued. The lamp smell faded as the night air from the window, slightly open, moved very slowly through the room and took the smell with it, out and upward into the dark above the rooftops where it had nowhere particular to go. The Empress Irene is one of the figures who does not fit comfortably into any simple category the Byzantine sources provide, and the discomfort is instructive. She was Athenian, an orphan who had come to Constantinople as a bride for the heir to the throne, and who had demonstrated, over the years of her husband's short reign and the long regency she held for their son, a capacity for political survival that required both genuine ability and a willingness to do what was necessary, which in the Byzantine context covered a considerable range. She restored icon veneration. The Second Council of Nicaea in 787 convened under her authority, the first ecumenical council in over a century, formally reversed the iconoclast position of the 754 Council, and restored the veneration of images as Orthodox practice. This was a genuine achievement, and it earned her a reputation in the Eastern Church that has lasted. She is venerated as a saint in the Orthodox tradition. She also had her son blinded. The son, Constantine VI, had been emperor in name during her regency, and then in fact, and the relationship between them had been contested almost from the beginning of his actual rule. He had his own supporters, his own ideas, his own ambitions, and they conflicted with hers. In 797, after a period of political struggle that had moved through exile and return and renewed conflict, Irene arranged for her son to be seized and his eyes destroyed with sufficient thoroughness that he could no longer function as emperor. He died some years later from the injuries, or from conditions connected to them. Irene then ruled as emperor, not empress, emperor in the masculine form of the title, in her own name for 5 years, until she was herself deposed and exiled by a palace conspiracy. She died in exile on the island of Lesbos in 803. The question of whether the blinding of her son was a calculated act of political necessity or something else is a question the sources were not in a position to answer without bias, and modern historians are not in a position to answer without speculation. What can be said is that it happened, and that it was not the most unusual event of its kind in Byzantine political history. Blinding as an alternative to execution, had a long and grim career in imperial politics, being theoretically preferable to killing on the grounds that a blind man could not rule, and therefore that the problem was resolved without the sin of murder, but that it remains one of the more arresting facts about a century that produced several. The market district of Constantinople at the height of its commercial life was a particular thing to move through at midday. The covered markets, the great vaulted spaces where the more organized trade happened, held the heat of the noon hour differently from the open streets. The air inside was close, weighted, a compound of a dozen kinds of merchandise and the people handling them. From the street, looking in, what was most immediately visible was color. The specific deep blue of glazed tile on the columns at the market's entrance. A blue that the noon light hit directly and made almost luminous. The dyes of bolted cloth stacked in a dye merchant's stall. The yellow and red and white of produce in the market section where the streets opened into a courtyard. The sound was layered in a way that made it difficult to separate one strand from another. Voices in several languages. Greek the dominant tongue, but not the only one, since the city's trading relationships brought in merchants from the Caucasus, from the Italian cities, from the Slavic principalities to the north, from the Arab world to the south and east. The sound of negotiation, which has a rhythm of its own regardless of language. The sound of goods being shifted, containers opened, weights placed on scales. Somewhere toward the far end of the covered section, a persistent metallic tapping that might have been a craftsman working at a portable setup, or might have been something structural. The glazed tile at the entrance had been there long enough to have acquired a fine layer of something. Not dirt exactly, more like the residue of close air and many hands and years of proximity to the city's daily life, that dimmed it slightly at the corners and edges while leaving the center of each tile with its original intensity. The noon light made even the dimmed portions glow faintly, the blue holding its ground. The theological controversy resolved itself after a second phase of iconoclasm under Emperors Leo V, Michael II, and Theophilos in 843, when the regent Theodora, a different Theodora from Justinian's empress, a century's namesake, restored icon veneration for the final time. The restoration is still celebrated in the Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy, marked on the first Sunday of Lent. The icons returned to the walls of the churches. The monks who had maintained the tradition through two phases of official suppression were vindicated. The dynasty that had produced this century of theological turmoil was running out. The Macedonian dynasty, founded by Basil Thursust in 867, a man who had risen from Macedonian peasant origins through the imperial court, with a speed that required both ability and a willingness to remove obstacles, including the Emperor Michael III, whom he had murdered, would produce the empire's next great era. But that is the next century's story. The 8th and 9th centuries left the empire smaller than they had found it and more itself. The contraction had clarified something. What remained was what had endured: the city, the walls, the church, the administrative machinery, the Greek language, the theological tradition that had now fought off two attempts to alter it and emerged with a definition of orthodoxy that would not be seriously challenged from within for centuries. A civilization that knows what it believes and why it believes it, even if it arrived at that knowledge through conflict, is in some ways more stable than one that has never been forced to define itself. The walls stood. The bells rang across the water at the appointed hours. The city, smaller than it had been, continued to be what it was. Chapter 6. The 9th and 10th centuries. The Macedonian Renaissance. Basil I did not look like a dynasty's founder. He looked like what he was, a man who had come a very long way from very modest origins, and had not forgotten, in the way that people who have come a long way sometimes do not forget, exactly what the distance had cost and what it had required. He was physically large by the source's account, and practically minded in the way that people who have managed their own survival without assistance tend to be practically minded. He had risen through the imperial court as a companion and favorite of the Emperor Michael III, acquired influence through proximity, and then made the calculation, at some point that the sources describe differently depending on their sympathies, that proximity was no longer the fastest path to what he wanted. Michael III was murdered in 867. Basil became emperor. The sources that are hostile to Basil emphasize the murder. The sources that are sympathetic to him, and there are many since Basil founded the dynasty that produced most of the empire's historians for the next 2 centuries, emphasize the dynasty. This is how historical reputation usually works. The act that creates the thing is judged by the thing it creates. Basil created something that lasted nearly 2 centuries and produced some of the most capable emperors the empire would have. The act that made it possible is noted and set aside. What Basil actually did with the throne, once he had it, was substantial. He was a competent military commander who stabilized the Balkan frontier and pressed the Arabs in the east. He initiated a legal reform project, the Basilica, a reworking and updating of Justinian's corpus into Greek, reorganized for the legal practices of the 9th century rather than the 6th, that his son Leo VI would complete. He built churches and repaired others. He survived long enough to establish that the dynasty was real, that it would continue, that his sons would follow him. He died in 886 in a hunting accident, thrown from a horse by the most common account, which is the kind of death that strikes biographers as incongruously ordinary for someone whose life had been anything but. Leo VA, who followed his father to the throne and is called the Wise by tradition, a sobriquet that refers to his considerable scholarly interests rather than to any particular wisdom in his personal life, which was complicated in ways that the Church found difficult to accommodate, ruled from 886 to 912 and spent a remarkable proportion of that reign in theological controversy of his own manufacture. The controversy was this: Leo's first wife died without producing an heir. His second wife died likewise. His third wife died after giving birth to a daughter who did not survive. The Church's position, developed carefully over the preceding centuries, was that a second marriage was tolerable, a third marriage was barely permissible, and a fourth marriage was not. Leo wanted a fourth wife. Specifically, he wanted to legitimate his relationship with a woman named Zoe Carbonopsina, Zoe of the coal-black eyes, which tells you something about how the sources remembered her, who had already borne him a son. The son's name was Constantine, and legitimating him was the point. Leo eventually achieved the fourth marriage, after a prolonged dispute with the Patriarch of Constantinople that involved the Patriarch's deposition and replacement, the intervention of the Pope in Rome, and a degree of ecclesiastical negotiation that left everyone involved in a state of qualified dissatisfaction. The son, Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, born in the porphyry-walled imperial birthing chamber, was legitimated. Constantine VII grew up to be one of the most intellectually interesting emperors the dynasty produced, and one of the least militarily engaged. He reigned in various configurations of regency and co-emperorship and finally sole rule from 913 to 959, and during that time he wrote substantially and with genuine interest, encyclopedias of court ceremony, administrative guides to the provinces, a biography of his grandfather Basil I that is not entirely to be trusted on the subject of Basil's more irregular methods of advancement, but that is nonetheless a remarkable document. He commissioned scholarship. He presided over what historians have called the Macedonian Renaissance, a systematic effort to collect, organize, and transmit the learning of the classical and late antique world, to make encyclopedias of everything from military tactics to agricultural practice, to the history of earlier empires, so that none of it would be lost. Constantine himself probably did not lead armies. The armies of his reign were led by generals, Nicephorus Phocas among them, who would eventually become emperor himself, and those armies were doing something significant on the eastern frontier. Before dawn, in a monastery courtyard somewhere in Greece, the air was cold in the specific way that enclosed stone spaces are cold before the sun finds them. A cold that came not from the sky but from the ground and the walls, a stored cold that the stones had accumulated across the night and were now radiating outward into the open space of the courtyard. The flagstones underfoot were gray and slightly damp with the moisture that forms before dawn on surfaces that have been cold long enough. The smell was frankincense, drifting from inside the chapel at the courtyard's far end. The chapel door was open, propped or simply not pulled closed after whoever had entered first, and the light from inside fell across the threshold in a narrow wedge that did not reach very far across the dark courtyard. It was the warm yellow of lamplight, specific and small against the general pre-dawn gray. A monk was crossing the courtyard toward the open door. He moved at the pace of someone who has made this crossing many times and does not need to think about it. Not hurrying, not dawdling, simply moving at the pace the body finds when the mind is elsewhere, or in that particular state of early morning that is not quite waking and not quite sleeping, but something between the two that the monastic schedule had, over centuries, organized itself around rather than against. His sandals on the flagstones were nearly silent. The cold came up through them anyway, through the leather into the soles of his feet, and he was aware of it without attending to it. The frankincense smell strengthened as he crossed the last few feet of courtyard and reached the threshold. He stepped inside without pause. The chapel received him. The door, from inside now, showed the rectangle of the courtyard's pre-dawn gray, the cold and the dark outside held at that threshold as if they were a different element entirely. The small sounds of the beginning office rose and then settled into their pattern. Outside, the courtyard remained as it had been. The cold continued. The dawn had not yet decided to arrive. The eastern frontier, in the mid-10th century, had been moving in the empire's favor for the first time since Heraclius. The reasons were partly structural. The Arab caliphate that had posed the most coherent threat to the empire in the 7th and 8th centuries had fragmented, the Abbasid dynasty losing effective control of its provinces, the frontier zones becoming less a confrontation between organized states and more a landscape of local powers, fortified towns, contested valleys. Into this landscape, the empire's revitalized armies moved with a deliberateness that the fragmenting opposition could not consistently meet. Nicephorus Phocas recovered Cilicia in 964 and 965, the flat coastal region between the Taurus Mountains and the sea that had been Arab territory for 3 centuries. He took Cyprus. In 969, his successor on the campaign, John Zimisces, recovered Antioch, the city that had been one of the 4 great patriarchates of the early church, one of the original centers of Christianity, lost since the Arab conquests of the 630s. The true cross, or a relic believed to be part of it, was returned to Constantinople. These were significant recoveries. They were not, however, the recovery of Egypt or Syria, the great wealthy provinces that had funded the Justinianic Empire and whose loss had never been compensated, only gradually adjusted to. The 10th century frontier successes extended the empire's reach, provided defensible positions, restored some revenue. They did not restore what the 7th century had taken. The empire that Nicephorus Phocas and John Zimisces were expanding was still in its fundamental structure, the compact and militarized state that the Arab conquests had forced into being. The expansion was real. Its limits were equally real. Nicephorus Phocas became emperor in 963 following Constantine VII's son Romanos II. He was a military man in the most literal sense, ascetic, disciplined, reportedly sleeping on a bearskin on the floor rather than the imperial bed, maintaining the habits of a frontier soldier even in the palace. He was also, by several accounts, unpopular in the city in ways that emperors who are successful generals and poor politicians tend to be unpopular. The taxes he raised to fund his campaigns landed on the city's population with a weight they resented, and his personal manner did not soften the resentment. He was murdered in the palace in 969 by John Zimisces, with the assistance of the Empress Theophano, who had been Romanos II's widow and Nikephoros' wife in succession, and who appears in the sources as a woman of considerable political agency and considerable ruthlessness, which the sources, as with Theodora, as with Irene, have difficulty rendering without a quality of nervous admiration. The silk workshops of Constantinople were, for a period of several centuries, one of the empire's more remarkable economic instruments. Silk had come to the Byzantine world through a process that combined patience, observation, and a willingness to do something that was technically a form of theft, though the thing stolen was not an object but knowledge. The raw silk trade from China, moving along the Central Asian routes, had been a Persian monopoly at the point where it entered the Mediterranean world, which meant that the empire had been paying the Persians for silk at terms the Persians set for as long as the trade had existed. Justinian had attempted various workarounds, including a sea route through Ethiopia, none of which fully resolved the problem. What resolved it, according to the 6th century historian Procopius, was 2 monks who had spent time in the East and who arrived at Justinian's court with silkworm eggs concealed inside hollow walking staffs, canes, reeds, some version of a hollow container plausible enough that the guards did not examine it. The eggs were hatched. The silkworms were fed on mulberry leaves. The process of producing raw silk, which requires the silkworm to spin its cocoon and the cocoon to be carefully processed before the threads can be reeled off, was laboriously reconstructed from what the monks remembered and what could be worked out by observation. Whether the story is precisely true in all its details is uncertain. What is certain is that by the 7th century, silk production was established in the empire, and by the 9th and 10th centuries, the imperial silk workshops in Constantinople, the state-controlled facilities that produced the most sought-after silk in the Mediterranean world, had become both a significant source of revenue and a diplomatic instrument. The purple-dyed silks that were the exclusive preserve of the imperial family were not available for purchase at any price. They were gifts, distributed by the emperor to foreign rulers as tokens of esteem calibrated carefully to rank. A lesser silk, still of high quality, could be purchased in the regulated markets. The regulation was strict. The workshop masters were imperial officials. The trade was, in the manner of Byzantine state control of economic activity generally, managed rather than free. The silk monopoly was eventually broken by Italian merchants, primarily Venetians and Genoans, who developed their own sources and their own production over the following centuries. But for a period of perhaps 300 years, the workshops of Constantinople produced something that the rest of the known world wanted and could only obtain on terms the empire set. Basil II came to the throne in effective rather than nominal terms in 976, and he reigned until his death in 1025, 49 years, the longest reign in Byzantine history up to that point. He was the grandson of Constantine VII, the great-grandson of Basil I, the product of the dynasty's internal logic in ways that went well beyond bloodline. He was, in the military tradition of Nicephorus Phocas and John Zimisces, a soldier emperor. He was also something those predecessors had not been, a man who understood the administrative and financial dimensions of power as clearly as he understood the military ones, and who had learned both lessons in the hardest possible school. His early reign was not secure. There were 2 major aristocratic rebellions, Bardas Skleros and then Bardas Phocas, men who commanded armies and controlled territories and who believed, with some justification, that they were as capable of being emperor as the young man in the palace. Basil survived them by seeking help from Vladimir of Kiev, who sent 6,000 Varangian soldiers, Norsemen effectively, men from the Norse settlements in what is now Ukraine and Russia, in exchange for a Byzantine princess in marriage and, along with the princess, the Christian faith, which Vladimir then imposed on the Kievan state with the comprehensive conviction of a recent convert. The Bulgarian campaign consumed the middle and later decades of Basil's reign. The First Bulgarian Empire, under its ruler Samuel, had expanded substantially into the Balkans and posed a threat to the empire's Balkan territories that required decades of systematic military effort to answer. Basil answered it with the sustained patience of a man who understood that the answer to a complicated problem was usually a long time. He campaigned year after year, not always successfully, losing battles and returning. In 1014, at the Battle of Cladion, he captured approximately 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners. He had them blinded. Every 100th man was left with one eye so that he could lead the rest home. The blinded prisoners arrived at Samuel's court in a column that had walked for days, led by the one-eyed men at intervals. Samuel, by the source's account, died of shock within 2 days of seeing them. This is narrated in the sources with the matter-of-fact quality of an event that was unusual in scale but not in kind. Blinding as a punishment and a military statement had precedent. The scale here, 15,000, had none. Basil's epithet, the Bulgar Slayer, came from this, and he kept it. The Bulgarian Empire was incorporated into Byzantine territory by 1018. The frontier reached, at its furthest extent under Basil, from the Danube to Mesopotamia, from the Adriatic to the eastern edge of Anatolia. It was, as measured by geography, the empire's widest reach since Justinian. Basil too never married. He produced no children. He spent almost his entire adult life on campaign, sleeping in the field, running the empire's administration through correspondence from wherever the army happened to be. He was, by the sources, spare in his personal habits, contemptuous of the elaborate court ceremonial that most emperors found essential to their identity, and deeply, precisely competent at the things he had decided to be competent at. He left the empire at its geographic height to a brother who had been kept carefully away from power his entire life and had spent the intervening decades in the pleasures that absence of responsibility permits. The dynasty, which had held for nearly a century and a half, would last another 30 years after Basil's death before producing its final heir in the wrong gender and the wrong circumstance, and quietly ceasing to be a dynasty in any functional sense. What it had produced in those 150 years was an empire that knew what it was: military, orthodox, administratively coherent, Greek in language and Roman in its self-understanding, capable of scholarship and of savagery in proportions that shifted with the century and the emperor and the problem being addressed. The bells rang across the water. The monks in their courtyard finished the dawn office and went to their work. The city continued. Chapter 7: 1,000 Miles of Road. Manzikert and its Aftermath. The 50 years between Basil II's death in 1025 and the accession of Alexios I Komnenos in 1081 produced 13 emperors, which is an average of just under 4 years per reign, which is not an average that suggests stability. Some of those reigns were shorter than 4 years. Some ended in blinding, which was the Byzantine political tradition's preferred method of removing a rival without technically committing murder, though the distinction between blinding a man thoroughly and killing him was in practice a narrow one. Some ended in exile. A few ended in natural death, though natural death in the Middle Byzantine palace had a way of arriving at convenient moments. The problem was structural rather than personal. Basil too had, with considerable intention, kept the military aristocracy, the great landowning families of Anatolia who produced the empire's best generals and controlled its most productive territories, carefully subordinated to central authority. He had legislated against their land acquisitions, taxed them heavily, kept their most capable members occupied on his campaigns rather than building independent power bases. This worked while Basil was alive because Basil was the kind of man it worked with. After his death, the central authority that was supposed to maintain this subordination was occupied by a sequence of emperors who were either incapable of exercising it, uninterested in exercising it, or in power for too short a time to exercise it at all. The military aristocracy expanded its land holdings. The professional army that Basil had kept supplied and paid and trained and led was increasingly supplemented and then replaced by mercenary forces that were cheaper to maintain in peacetime and considerably less reliable in the kind of sustained crisis that peacetime armies exist to prevent. The treasury that Basil had left full was drawn down by emperors who preferred the ceremonial dimensions of the role to its administrative ones. The frontier commanders who needed supplies and reinforcements sent requests to a capital that was managing a court and managing a succession and managing the politics of the church, and found it difficult to also manage Anatolia. Into this interval, from the east came the Seljuk Turks. They were not the first Turkish people the empire had encountered. The steppe peoples who pressed against and through the empire's northern frontiers had included Turkic groups for centuries. The Pechenegs, the Cumans, others whose names appear in the sources and then disappear as their political formations dissolved or were absorbed or moved elsewhere. The Seljuks were different in the way that matters historically. They were organized, they were Muslim. They had conquered the Abbasid Caliphate's heartland in Persia and Iraq and made themselves the military arm of Sunni Islam in the mid-11th century, and they were expanding. Their expansion into Anatolia was initially a raiding expansion rather than a conquest. Cavalry raids deep into Byzantine territory, striking and withdrawing, seeking plunder rather than administration, testing the frontiers rather than occupying them. The raids were serious enough to require response, and the response required an emperor who was capable of organizing one. In 1068, Romanos IV Diogenes came to the throne specifically as a military candidate. The Empress Eudokia, regent for her young sons, married him with the understanding that the empire needed a soldier in the palace rather than another administrator or scholar. Romanos was a capable general by the standards of the preceding 50 years, which is to say he was more capable than his immediate predecessors without being capable in the way that the coming crisis required. He spent 3 campaigning seasons pushing into eastern Anatolia, trying to establish a forward position that would prevent the Seljuk raids from penetrating as deeply as they had been penetrating. The campaigns were partially successful in limited operational terms and strategically inconclusive. In 1071, he moved east again with a larger force, aiming for the fortress of Manzikert near Lake Van in the high country of eastern Anatolia, where the plateau begins to rise toward the Armenian highlands. What happened at Manzikert on the 19th of August, 1071, has been reconstructed by historians from sources that were written after the fact, at some distance, with varying degrees of information and varying degrees of interest in accuracy. The battle itself, the engagement between the Byzantine army and the Seljuk force under Sultan Alp Arslan, was preceded by a failed negotiation, included a maneuver by Byzantine forces that broke down in a way that may have been accidental or may have been treachery depending on which source is trusted, and ended with the Byzantine army in flight and Romanos IV Diogenes captured. The Sultan Alp Arslan received the captured emperor with a courtesy that the sources note with some surprise. There were negotiations, a ransom was agreed, Romanos was released. He returned to Constantinople to find that a new emperor had already been proclaimed in his absence, his stepson Michael VII, supported by the civil aristocracy that had never been comfortable with Romanos's military emphasis. The agreement Romanos had made with the Seljuks was repudiated. Romanos himself was captured, blinded, and died of his injuries within the year. The ransom that might have secured a treaty was never paid. The territory conceded in the negotiations was claimed by neither side as bound. What followed in the absence of the settlement that the capture and release had briefly made possible was not a clear Seljuk conquest of Anatolia, but something more disorganized and in some ways more damaging. A decade of Byzantine civil war and Seljuk infiltration, with Turkish groups occupying the inland plateau almost by default, moving into the space that the retreating and fighting Byzantine factions left open. By the early 1080s, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, from the Turkish word for Rome, which tells you something about how the Turks understood what they were inheriting, had established itself across central Anatolia. Anatolia had been the empire's heartland for 4 centuries. It was the recruiting ground, the agricultural base, the territorial depth that made Constantinople defensible. Its loss, not in a single dramatic battle, but in a decade of fragmentation and infiltration, was the hinge on which the empire's long decline turned. Though the empire would not decline quickly, and would in fact recover considerably before the final end, the theme of Anatolian recovery was one that every competent emperor from Alexios I onward would pursue and none would achieve completely. A small church in Thessaloniki, in the middle of an afternoon that had turned cold despite the season, held only a lamp and what the lamp touched. The stone of the walls was thick, the kind of thickness that keeps a space cool in summer and cold in winter, that makes the interior of an old stone building a climate of its own, related to but not governed by the climate outside. The chill came through the walls evenly, from all sides at once. Not a draft, but a general ambient cold that settled on everything in the room and required the lamp to do more than illuminate. The lamp stood on a shelf at the far end of the nave, before a small icon, a figure in the flat, frontal manner of Byzantine devotional painting, gold ground visible at the edges of the image, the colors darker than they had been when new, deepened by the years and the lamp smoke and the hands that had touched the frame without quite touching the image itself. The flame was still, no air moved in the church at this hour. The flame stood upright and did not waver. The light it threw reached the nearest walls and the nearest columns and did not go much farther, leaving the back half of the nave in a dimness that was not quite dark. Enough light reached it indirectly to make shapes visible. The benches along the walls, the slight variations in the stone floor where generations of feet had worn some paths smoother than others. The dimness had a quality of waiting to it, the quality of a space between one thing and the next, between the last person who had been here and the next person who would come. Outside, the afternoon was doing what cold afternoons do in northern cities, shortening, the light going gray at the edges, the streets emptying by degrees as the temperature continued its patient downward work. Inside, the lamp held its position. Alexios I Komnenos took the throne in 1081 by the method that the Byzantine political tradition had established as legitimate for men of sufficient ability and insufficient patience. He marched on Constantinople at the head of an army and was proclaimed emperor before anyone in the palace could organize an adequate resistance. He was in his middle 20s. He would reign for 37 years, and the quality of those years, the sustained, improvising, adaptive intelligence brought to bear on a situation that had gone considerably past difficult, has given him a reputation that sits just below the very first rank of Byzantine emperors, and well above almost everyone who came after. The situation he inherited was this. The Seljuks held most of Anatolia. The Normans, the same Norman military culture that had conquered England in 1066, in another branch, held the last Byzantine territories in southern Italy and were raiding across the Adriatic into Byzantine Greece. The Pechenegs were pressing the Danube frontier. The treasury was depleted. The army was whatever could be assembled from what the preceding decades had left. Alexios addressed these problems in sequence, at a pace that circumstances determined rather than preference. The Normans were dealt with through a combination of military resistance and diplomatic maneuvering that kept them from consolidating their Adriatic position. The Pechenegs were broken in 1091 at the Battle of Livonian, with the help of Cuman allies, a pattern of using one-step people against another that the empire had practiced for centuries. The Seljuks remained in Anatolia, and Alexios knew that recovering Anatolia required more than the empire currently possessed. In 1095, he sent ambassadors to the Council of Piacenza in Italy, where Pope Urban II was holding a church council. What Alexios asked for was military assistance, not a crusade exactly, not what arrived, but some form of Western military help that could serve as the force he could not himself supply. What Urban II launched a few months later at Clermont was the First Crusade, a call for Christian warriors to march to the liberation of Jerusalem, a project that had its own theology and its own momentum and its own ideas about who was in charge, none of which corresponded precisely to what Alexios had had in mind. The First Crusade arrived at Constantinople in 1096 and 1097 in waves, large armed groups, mostly from France and Norman Italy, with their own commanders and their own objectives, and a relationship to Byzantine authority that was cooperative when it was convenient and fractious when it was not. Alexios extracted oaths from the Crusade's leaders that recovered territories would be held as Byzantine vassals. The oaths were given and then variously interpreted and variously honored. Nicaea was recovered in 1097 and returned to the empire. Antioch was taken after a long siege in 1098 and not returned. The Norman Bohemond of Taranto established his own principality there, which produced a prolonged conflict with Constantinople that occupied Alexios and his successors for decades. Jerusalem was taken in 1099. The Crusader states established in Palestine and Syria created a new political landscape in the Eastern Mediterranean that the empire had to navigate, sometimes as ally, sometimes as rival, sometimes as the thing that the Crusaders forgot to coordinate with because they had stopped thinking of it as the same enterprise. They came from the north, from the Norse settlements along the rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine. Men who had traveled those rivers south to Constantinople, drawn by the city's wealth and the empire's need for soldiers who were not enmeshed in the empire's own political complications. They were called Varangians, from a Norse word meaning something like sworn companion, and the guard they formed, the Varangian Guard, was the emperor's personal household troops from roughly the late 10th century onward, the men who stood closest to the throne and were trusted there precisely because they had no family connection to the empire's internal politics, no estates in Anatolia, no cousins in the Senate. They were large men, by Byzantine account, fair-haired, carrying the long-handled axes that were their distinctive weapon, the labres, a broad double axe that required a tall man and considerable strength to use effectively, and that the sources describe with a quality of impressed wariness. They drank, the sources note, with the conviction of people from cold climates, for whom drink was a philosophical commitment rather than a social one. They were loyal, within the specific terms of the loyalty they had sworn, and the terms did not always extend to preventing the assassination of the emperor they were guarding when the assassin was someone the emperor had trusted into the inner rooms. But they were as loyal as anyone in the palace, and more reliably so than most. They were also, in their later generations, not exclusively Norse. English soldiers arrived in Constantinople after the Norman conquest of 1066, men who had lost their place in the world that the Normans had made and who found in the Varangian Guard a use for their military skills and a sufficient distance from the New England that the distance itself was comfort. The Guard's roster, across the 11th and 12th centuries, included Norsemen, Danes, Anglo-Saxons, and eventually Rus, a mixture of northern Europe gathered in the service of a Greek empire on the Bosphorus, carrying axes in a palace full of silk and gold, and the accumulated ceremony of a civilization that had been at this for 7 centuries before the first Varangian arrived. They are last mentioned in the sources with any operational significance in 1204, defending the walls against the Fourth Crusade. After 1204, the Guard disappears from the record, the way many things disappeared from the record in that year. The Bosphorus, seen from the Asian shore in the late afternoon, had the specific quality of water that is also a road. It was not wide, at its narrowest, barely a kilometer, close enough that the opposite shore was visible in detail. The buildings of the city's outer districts distinct and particular rather than blurred into general mass. The water moved with the particular logic of a strait, not the open movement of the sea, but something channeled and directional. The current making its way from the Black Sea to the Marmara in a steady south-flowing stream that boats had to account for and work with rather than simply cross. A ship was making the crossing in the late light, not a large vessel, a trading boat of moderate size, carrying something in its hold that settled it low enough in the water that its freeboard was modest, its deck close to the surface. It moved at the angle that sailors learn for this crossing, heading upstream of the destination to let the current carry it to the right landing point. An adjustment so automatic in an experienced crew that it was not a decision, but simply the way the thing was done. The light at this hour had gone from its afternoon directness to something more oblique, more golden, the kind of light that arrives before sunset and makes water look like a different material than it is during the day, heavier, more reflective, the surface catching the sky's color and returning it with interest. The ship moved across this surface with its own reflection running below it, a darker double that kept pace exactly. On the Asian shore, whoever was watching, if anyone was watching, would have seen a ship crossing from Europe to Asia in the late afternoon, moving at its corrected angle against the current, settling toward the city's landing stages as the light continued its slow change. An ordinary sight, a sight the strait had been producing, with variations in the size and type of vessel, for as long as the city had existed. The water moved south, the ship moved west, the light continued. Chapter 8. The Wound That Would Not Close. The Fourth Crusade and Its Aftermath. Manuel I Komnenos, who ruled from 1143 to 1180, was the last emperor of his dynasty who believed the empire could be something larger than it had become, and he pursued that belief with an energy and a resource expenditure that the empire could not quite sustain, but that, while he was alive to direct it, produced results impressive enough to conceal the cost. He was a tall man, physically imposing in a way the sources mention with the attentiveness reserved for things that mattered in a culture where the emperor's body was a public object, the visible form of imperial authority. He jousted, a Western practice that he had acquired through the Crusader contacts that were a significant part of his diplomatic world, and that he pursued with the enthusiasm of someone who had found in it a combination of physical competition and symbolic display that suited his self-presentation. He corresponded with Western rulers as an equal, in the Latin that Byzantine court education now included, partly because the Crusades had made Latin-speaking neighbors permanent features of the Eastern Mediterranean landscape. He married a Western princess, and his son married another. He also spent heavily on campaigns in Italy, attempting to recover the old Byzantine territories in the south, which the Normans held, and which Manuel believed could be leveraged back into the empire's orbit through a combination of military pressure and the diplomatic complexity of Italian city politics. The attempt failed. The military results were inconclusive. The Italian cities that had seemed interested in Byzantine alliance became less interested when Byzantine military force proved insufficient to make the interest profitable. Manuel returned his attention to the east, where he managed the Crusader states, the Seljuks, and the Serbian and Hungarian kingdoms to the north, with a diplomatic skill that kept the empire's influence larger than its military power strictly warranted. In 1176, at the Battle of Myriokephalon in the Phrygian highlands, a Byzantine army marching into Seljuk territory was ambushed in a pass and badly defeated. Manuel survived and extracted the army, but the defeat, which he compared in a letter to the disaster of Manzikert, a comparison that the sources record with some of the weight he clearly intended it to carry, ended the possibility of serious Byzantine military pressure on the Seljuks in his reign. He spent his remaining 4 years managing the consequences. He died in 1180. He left a son of 11. What followed in the next 2 decades was the Komnenian dynasty's rapid and somewhat bewildering collapse, achieved through a combination of regency politics, palace violence, and the particular instability that attaches to a dynasty when its founding competence has been exhausted, and what remains is the name and the expectation without the substance that had once filled them. Andronikos I Komnenos, who seized power in 1182 through a popular movement that was also a massacre. The Latin residents of Constantinople were killed in the thousands. The Western merchants and craftsmen and Crusader-adjacent settlers whose presence in the city had grown considerably under Manuel's Western policy, and who now paid for that presence in the most final way, ruled for 3 years with a combination of genuine reforming intention and genuine brutality that the sources find difficult to separate into components because Andronikos himself apparently did not separate them. He was in his 60s when he took power, and proceeded as a man who had waited a long time and did not intend to be patient now that his moment had arrived. In 1185 he was deposed by a mob, an actual mob, the city's population deciding collectively that enough was enough, and killed in public in a manner that the sources describe with a specificity that serves no purpose here, except to note that the death of an emperor who had authorized a massacre of the city's residents some years earlier was not, in this case, peaceful. Isaac II Angelos came to the throne by the improbable method of killing the man who had come to arrest him on Andronikos's orders, and then being acclaimed emperor by the crowd that had gathered to watch. He was 24. He ruled, with an interruption, until 1204. And the reign was the kind that historians write about with the patient exhaustion of people cataloging a long series of missed opportunities and compounding errors, each one making the next more likely, the whole adding up to a situation that had not been inevitable at any single point and had nonetheless arrived at catastrophe. The Fourth Crusade was called by Pope Innocent III in 1198. It was intended to recover Jerusalem, which Saladin had taken from the Crusader kingdoms in 1187. It was the fourth major expedition of this kind, and it was going to be different from the third, which had failed, and the second, which had also failed, and managed to be different in a way that its planners had not intended and that produced consequences they had not imagined. The crusade needed ships. The ships were Venetian. The Venetians negotiated a contract, a very specific, very Venetian contract, for transport and supply in exchange for a sum of money and a share of the conquered territory. The Crusaders who gathered at Venice in 1202 were fewer than anticipated and had less money than the contract required. The Venetians, led by the elderly and reportedly blind Doge Enrico Dandolo, a man who appears in the sources as someone who understood leverage with the precision of a civilization that had been practicing commercial leverage for centuries, proposed an alternative. The Crusaders could work off their debt by helping Venice recover the city of Zara on the Adriatic, which had placed itself under Hungarian protection. Zara was a Christian city, the Pope objected. The crusade took Zara anyway. Then a Byzantine prince arrived, Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Isaac II, who had been blinded and imprisoned by his brother Alexios III, who had taken the throne in 1195, presented himself to the Crusade's leadership with a proposition. "Help me restore my father to the throne of Constantinople," he said, "and I will pay your Venetian debt, supply your crusade, submit the Greek Church to Rome, and join the crusade myself with a large force." The offer addressed several problems at once. The crusade's leadership, after debate that the sources record in some detail, accepted it. The fleet appeared before Constantinople in June of 1203. The city's defenses were sufficient, in theory. The Emperor Alexios III, who had usurped the throne and now found the usurpation somewhat less comfortable, fled with a quantity of imperial treasure. The blind Isaac II was restored. His son was crowned Alexios IV beside him. The crusade anchored in the Golden Horn and waited for the promises to be fulfilled. They could not be. The money did not exist in the quantities promised. The Greek Church showed no interest in submitting to Rome, and the new emperor had no means of compelling it. The population of Constantinople, which had watched a Western fleet install an emperor, found the situation less acceptable by the month. In January of 1204, a palace revolution deposed and imprisoned the Angeloi, both Isaac and his son, and placed a new emperor on the throne. The younger Alexios was strangled in prison. Isaac died shortly after, of causes the sources describe variously. The crusade, which was now owed money by a government that no longer existed, and which was encamped in the Golden Horn with winter ending and spring arriving and the practical problem of feeding a large military force asserting itself against every other consideration, made a decision. On the 12th of April, 1204, the crusading fleet forced the harbor chain and the army breached the sea walls. Constantinople was taken for the first time in its history, not by Persians, not by Arabs, not by Bulgarians, but by the crusading army of Western Christendom, whose stated purpose was the recovery of Jerusalem. 3 days of sacking followed. The accumulated wealth of a civilization that had been gathering, preserving, and displaying for 9 centuries moved westward. The great bronze horses that had stood in the hippodrome since Constantine's day went to Venice, where they still stand, or stood until quite recently, replacements now occupying the original position, above the entrance to the Basilica of San Marco. Relics, manuscripts, silver, gold, ivory, silk. The Venetians specifically were systematic about what they took and where they sent it. The others were less systematic and no less thorough. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was established, with a Flemish count named Baldwin on the throne. It would last until 1261. On a winter road in Thrace, in the deep of a night that had closed around everything, a rider moved at a pace that was not quite a gallop. The road was too uncertain for that in the dark, but faster than a walk, the horse finding its footing by the quality of the surface under its hooves, in a way that horses manage in darkness that their riders cannot. The cold was absolute, not the dramatic cold of a storm, but the settled, total cold of a clear winter night at its lowest point, when everything that was going to freeze had frozen, and the air was still, and the sky was enormous and full of stars that in this cold seemed closer than they did in other seasons, as if the air's quality changed how far light could travel through it. The horse's breath came in bursts of vapor that the lamplight, a small lantern fastened to the saddle, briefly illuminated, and then fell behind, left hanging in the air as the horse passed through them. The sound of hooves on the frozen road was a hard, clean sound, unlike the muffled sound of the same road in warmer weather. It carried in the still air a considerable distance before the night absorbed it. The rider did not look up at the stars. The rider watched the road. This was the road between one place and another, between a message given and a message received, between something that had happened and someone who needed to know that it had happened. That purpose was enough. The road continued through the dark. The horse continued on the road. The cold pressed in from all sides with the impersonal constancy of a season doing what seasons do. The lamplight held its small circle of amber around the horse and rider and moved with them, leaving the darkness behind it unchanged. The Byzantine successor states that survived the Latin Empire's establishment, the Empire of Nicaea in northwestern Anatolia, the Despotate of Epirus in northwestern Greece, the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. Each believed themselves to be the legitimate continuation of what Constantinople had been. Nicaea had the most credible claim, the most organized administration, and the most capable sequence of rulers in the half-century it existed before 1261. The Latin Empire that occupied Constantinople was not strong. It held the city and some surrounding territory. It was chronically underfunded, perpetually reliant on Venice for naval and commercial support, and unable to expand against the Greek successor states on its borders. or the Bulgarian Empire to the north. It persisted through the inertia of having been established rather than through any particular vitality. Michael VIII Palaiologos, who had made himself Emperor of Nicaea in 1259, retook Constantinople in July of 1261, not through a major military assault, but through a night operation in which a Nicaean general named Alexios Strategopoulos led a small force through an unguarded section of the walls, while the Latin garrison was elsewhere. The city fell in hours. The Latin Emperor Baldwin II fled by ship, reportedly leaving through a window of the palace and making his way to the docks. Michael VIII entered the city on foot, as Heraclius had entered Jerusalem, in a gesture that the ceremonial intelligence of the Byzantine court understood precisely. The empire was restored. The city was back in Greek hands. The Hagia Sophia, which had been a Roman Catholic cathedral for 57 years, became an Orthodox church again. The bells that had been rung for Latin rites were rung for Greek ones. What the restoration did not restore was the city's wealth, its population, or its territorial base. The empire that Michael VIII ruled was a fraction of what the Komnenian dynasty had governed. Much of Anatolia was Seljuk. The Latin principalities established by the Crusades remained in Greece and the islands. The Venetian and Genoese trading networks that had established themselves during the Latin interlude remained, negotiated into continued presence by commercial realities that the empire needed and could not simply expel. The Palaiologos dynasty, which would be the last, began its reign as the survivor of a catastrophe rather than the inheritor of a tradition, and something of that character clung to the dynasty through the century and a half that remained. Gold-ground mosaic, the specific visual tradition of Byzantine religious art, achieves something that ordinary painting in the same period does not attempt and would not know how to achieve if it tried. The background is gold, not the representation of gold, not paint mixed to approximate its color, but gold leaf applied to the surface and then covered with a final layer of glass, which gives it a depth and a reflectiveness that paint cannot replicate. In the light of candles or oil lamps, the light under which Byzantine mosaics were always intended to be seen, the gold ground does not simply reflect the light. It seems to hold it, to give it back from within, to create the impression that the light is coming from behind the image, rather than falling on it from the front. The figures stand in this golden space, or float in it rather, since the convention of Byzantine devotional painting is not the convention of depicted physical presence. The figures are frontal, they look at the viewer directly, not at each other, not at anything within the scene. The eyes are very large, the bodies elongated, the hands precise in their gestures, a specific positioning of fingers that carries meaning in the vocabulary of Byzantine iconographic convention, as precisely as words in a sentence carry meaning. There is no shadow. There is no indication of the kind of light that would cast a shadow, because the golden light of the ground is not the light of a time of day or a direction of illumination. It is uncreated light, the light of the divine realm in which the holy figures exist. A light that does not come from anywhere because it is not the light of the physical world at all. This is what Byzantine art is doing. It is not attempting to depict the world. It is attempting to depict what is behind the world, the reality that the visible world is an expression of, the presence that the figures in the mosaic are permanently in the presence of. The frontal gaze is not awkward, it is correct. It is the figure looking through the surface at you from a space beyond the gold. Standing before one of these mosaics in a lamplit church, the way every person who stood before them for 1,000 years stood before them in exactly this quality of light, is to understand, without requiring explanation, what the light is for. Chapter 9. The Last Purple. The Palaiologos Dynasty. The dynasty that Michael VIII founded would govern for 192 years, which is longer than it had any structural right to expect given the circumstances of its beginning and the circumstances through which it navigated. It governed a state that was contracting for most of those years, losing territory not in the dramatic manner of Manzikert, which at least had the clarity of a decisive defeat, but in the slower manner of a civilization that can no longer afford the cost of holding what it holds, that watches its edges fray and pulls back toward the center, that negotiates where it once commanded and pays where it once taxed. This is not a simple story of decline. The Palaiologos centuries were also centuries of genuine intellectual and artistic flowering, the period that scholars call the Palaiologan Renaissance, a last flourishing of Byzantine learning and theology and art that produced work of real quality and real originality even as the political and military situation steadily worsened. The mosaics of the Chora Church in Constantinople, produced in the early 14th century, are among the finest examples of Byzantine art in existence, made when the empire that commissioned them was already a fragment of its former extent. The theological controversies of the period were real controversies, pursued by people of genuine intelligence about questions that mattered to them. The capacity to produce beautiful things and serious thought while the external situation deteriorates is not a paradox. It is simply what civilizations do when the people within them are still alive and still thinking, regardless of what is happening at the borders. Michael VIII himself was a complicated figure in the way that founders of things tend to be complicated, the virtues and the methods too entangled to separate cleanly, the record containing items that his admirers preferred not to dwell on and his critics could not stop dwelling on. He had blinded and mutilated John IV Lascaris, the young legitimate emperor of Nicaea whom he had displaced, which was standard Byzantine political procedure and was nonetheless the blinding of a child. He pursued a union of the Orthodox and Roman churches, the Council of Lyon in 1274, at which Byzantine representatives accepted papal supremacy, as a diplomatic strategy to forestall a Western crusade against his recovered empire, which was rational foreign policy and also something that the Orthodox clergy and population of Constantinople found somewhere between repugnant and incomprehensible. The church union was repudiated almost immediately after Michael's death in 1282 by his son Andronikos II, who was responding to genuine popular feeling on the subject. The theological and cultural distance between Eastern and Western Christianity had grown wider during the Latin occupation, not narrower. The memory of 1204, of the sacking, the looting, the Latin priests installed in Orthodox churches, was not abstract. It was a generation old, and the city's population carried it as a specific grief rather than a general historical awareness. Andronikos II reigned for 46 years, from 1282 to 1328, which is a long time in any dynasty and a very long time in the Palaiologos dynasty specifically. He was a pious, learned, and financially conservative emperor who disbanded the Byzantine navy on the grounds that it was expensive and that Genoese ships could be hired as needed, which was a decision that made a kind of narrow budget sense and a great deal of no sense at all in any other register. The Genoese were in Constantinople on Genoese terms, operating from their colony at Galata across the Golden Horn with a commercial autonomy that the empire could not effectively tax or control. Hiring their ships meant hiring them at their prices for their purposes, which did not always align with the empire's. The Catalan Company arrived in 1303, a mercenary force of Aragonese and other Spanish soldiers who had been fighting in Sicily and were now unemployed and available, hired by Andronikos to fight the Turks in Anatolia, which they did for a period and then stopped doing when their pay arrived late, which it did repeatedly, because the empire's finances were in the condition they were in. The Catalans then ravaged Thrace for several years, which was not what they had been hired to do, and eventually established themselves in central Greece, where they remained for the better part of a century as the Duchy of Athens, one of the more improbable political formations the medieval Mediterranean produced. The Ottoman Turks, a different Turkish group from the Seljuks, a principality that had established itself in northwestern Anatolia in the late 13th century under a ruler named Osman, from whose name the dynasty and eventually the empire took their designation, began crossing into Europe in the 1350s. Not as conquerors initially, but as allies invited across the Bosphorus by the Emperor John VI Cantacuzene, who needed military help in the civil war he was fighting against the regency for John V Palaiologos. This invitation was the kind of decision that looks, in retrospect, like an obvious error, though it looked, in the moment, like the only available option. Cantacuzenos needed soldiers. The Ottomans had soldiers. The arrangement was formalized with a marriage. Cantacuzenos' daughter Theodora was married to the Ottoman Sultan Orhan, and the Ottoman force arrived in Europe and helped Cantacuzenos win his civil war, and then, with the unhurried logic of people who have found a foothold and intend to keep it, remained. There is a theological argument that runs through the Palaiologos centuries with the persistence of something that will not resolve, something too important to abandon and too contested to settle, the hesychast controversy, which is one of those Byzantine theological disputes that looks from the outside like a dispute about something very narrow and turns out on examination to be a dispute about something very large. The hesychasts were monks, primarily from the monastic communities of Mount Athos, the peninsula in northern Greece that had been a monastic community since the 10th century and that would remain one through every political change that the surrounding world produced. Their practice centered on a form of contemplative prayer, hesychia meaning stillness or quiet, that they believed, practiced correctly and persistently over years, could lead to a direct experience of the divine, not the divine as described in books, not the divine as approached through liturgy and sacrament, but the divine as directly, immediately perceived. The specific form this perception took, in hesychast theology, was the vision of an uncreated light, the same light, as they understood it, that the disciples had perceived at the Transfiguration, the light of Christ's divine nature made momentarily visible. Gregory Palamas, an Athonite monk who became the controversy's central theologian, argued that this uncreated light was genuinely ontologically distinct from God's essence, that God communicated himself to the world through energies that were real expressions of the divine nature without being the divine essence itself, which remained inaccessible. The light could be seen. God, in his essence, could not be seen. Both of these were true. His opponent, a Calabrian monk named Barlaam, argued that the distinction was incoherent, that to claim that the divine energies were genuinely divine and yet distinct from the divine essence was to introduce division into what must be simple, and that the hesychast claim to see uncreated light was either self-deception or something else that could be accounted for without positing a new category of ontology. The controversy ran through the 1330s and 1340s and was eventually settled, in the Byzantine manner, through councils that declared one position orthodox and the other heretical, in Palamas's favor. The Palamite theology became the normative framework of Orthodox Christianity, in which it has remained. Palamas is venerated as a saint. Barlaam returned to Italy and became a Roman Catholic bishop. The controversy, while it ran, intersected with the civil war between Cantacuzenos and the Palaiologos Regency, because Cantacuzenos supported Palamas and the Regency supported Barlaam, and theological and political allegiances had been braided together in Byzantine life for so long that disentangling them would have required more than anyone then alive was willing to attempt. In the evening, the Theodosian walls held the heat of the afternoon in their stone the way stone holds everything, impassively, without preference, as a simple consequence of mass and material and the hours of sun that had moved across them since morning. The outer face of the wall, at the point of a gate set into it, was warm under a hand placed flat against it. Not the aggressive warmth of a surface in direct sun. The sun had moved, and the shadow of the wall's upper courses fell across the lower sections now, but a stored warmth, deeper than surface temperature, radiating slowly outward from the stone's interior. The stone was very old, not uniformly old. It had been repaired and patched and rebuilt across the centuries, and the repairs were visible as variations in the color and texture of the facing, lighter sections where newer stone had been set against darker original courses. The joints between them sometimes precise and sometimes not, but the core was old, and the old core held a warmth that felt like more than temperature. Standing at the threshold of the gate, facing outward, the city was behind. Behind was the sound of it, the low, continuous presence of a place with many people in it, voices and movement, and the specific acoustic quality of dense urban space, which is not quite noise and not quite quiet, but a register between the two that the ear, after long enough, stops noticing. Ahead was the plain. The land outside the walls at evening was a different kind of quiet, the quiet of space rather than the quiet of stillness, the quiet of a view that extends without obstruction to the horizon in the fading light. The stone of the gate's arch overhead was cool where the inner face turned away from the afternoon. One hand on the outer warm face, one step forward and the air changed, became the air of outside, lighter, with the smell of the open land that the city's air did not have, something green and dry and wide. The walls stretched in both directions along the ridge, the towers at their intervals catching the last horizontal light on their western faces. They had been here for a very long time. They looked as if they expected to be here for a great deal longer. The evening continued. The city behind breathed its city breath. The plain ahead was still. The Ottoman encirclement was not a single event but a long process, a tightening that took generations and that the empire resisted, appealed against, negotiated around, and ultimately could not reverse. By the early 15th century, the pattern was clear even to those who preferred not to see it clearly. Constantinople was a city surrounded by Ottoman territory, connected to the rest of the Christian world only by sea, governing a hinterland that had shrunk to a few coastal territories and some Aegean islands and the Peloponnese. The emperors of the later Palaiologos period made the rounds of Western courts, Paris, London, Rome, Venice, seeking the military assistance that the First Crusade had demonstrated the West was capable of providing, and that subsequent experience had demonstrated the West would provide on its own terms and in its own time, which might not be the empire's time. The appeal was always the same. The Ottoman advance is not a Greek problem, but a Christian problem. If Constantinople falls, the Ottoman path into Central Europe is open. The Eastern Church will submit to Rome if Western arms come to the city's defense. The Western rulers listened, expressed sympathy, and did not send armies in the quantities that would have made a difference, for reasons that had to do with their own politics and their own wars, and the simple difficulty of organizing a major military expedition to a place very far away in the interests of a church they had spent the preceding 2 centuries in complicated and often hostile relationship with. The Council of Florence in 1439 produced a formal union of the Eastern and Western churches, or the appearance of one. The Byzantine Emperor John VIII attended in person, along with the Patriarch of Constantinople and a delegation of Orthodox clergy who debated with their Latin counterparts over several months and eventually signed documents of union that accepted the papal primacy and reconciled the doctrinal differences that had accumulated since 1054. The signing was genuine in the sense that the ink was real. The union was not genuine in the sense that the Orthodox clergy who signed it were under imperial pressure to do so, and the majority of them repudiated it on returning to Constantinople, and the population of the city had not been consulted and showed no signs of accepting the result. And the Grand Duke Lucas Notaras expressed what many apparently felt when he reportedly said he would rather see the Turkish turban in the city than the Latin mitre. The Union produced no Western army. The Crusade of Varna in 1444, which was the closest the West came to a military response, ended in disaster when the Hungarian and Polish forces were destroyed by the Ottomans in Bulgaria. The road to Constantinople remained open. Constantine Arenth Palaiologos became emperor in 1449, the last emperor, the 88th or 89th depending on how the count is made. He was a competent man, a soldier, not a scholar, without the agonized intellectual complexity of some of his predecessors, someone who understood what he had inherited and what it meant, and who seems to have decided, without drama, that his job was to hold what could be held, and to hold himself in the manner that the situation required. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, who had come to the throne in 1451 at the age of 19, had been thinking about Constantinople since before he was old enough to rule. He had studied the city's defenses, had read the accounts of previous sieges, had acquired the expertise of a Hungarian cannon founder named Urban, who had first offered his services to Constantine XI, and then, when the Byzantine Emperor could not pay his price, had offered them to Mehmed, who could. Urban built cannon, larger than anything that had been built before, capable of throwing stone shot of several hundred kilograms against fortifications that had been designed in an era before gunpowder. The siege began in April of 1453. The city's defenders, perhaps 7,000, against an Ottoman force that vastly outnumbered them, held the walls for 53 days. The Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani Longo organized the defense with skill and considerable bravery. Constantine XI was on the walls throughout. The great chain across the Golden Horn held. The land walls absorbed the cannon fire and were repaired, to the extent that they could be repaired night after night. On the 29th of May, the walls were breached. Justiniani was wounded and evacuated by ship. Constantine XI, by the accounts that survived, removed his imperial insignia and entered the last fighting on foot as a soldier rather than an emperor, and was not seen again. His body, if it was found, was not identified with certainty. He disappeared into the last hours of the city he had been given to hold, and the sources that might have recorded what happened to him were no longer in a position to record anything. Mehmed II entered the city the same day. He went first to the Hagia Sophia, which was converted to a mosque. He is reported to have stood in the building that had been the greatest church in Christendom for 916 years, and to have said, or been recorded as saying, something about the spider that weaves the curtains of the palace, and the owl that calls the watch upon the towers of Afrasiab, a quotation from Persian poetry about the transience of power, about the grass growing in the courts of the great. Whether he said it, and whether he meant what the words mean, are questions the historical record cannot finally answer. The city continued. Renamed, rebuilt, repopulated, it went on being what it had always been, the point where Europe and Asia face each other across a narrow channel of water that both separates and connects them, a city on a peninsula with water on three sides, the most consequential piece of real estate in the Western world for the better part of 2,000 years. The walls that Mehmed's cannon had finally breached still stand, most of them, in stretches. The stone is very old. Chapter 10. The Weight of Bells. What endures is rarely what was loudest. The battles that decided centuries are the loudest things in the historical record, the names that appear in every account, the dates that organize every narrative, the moments when the situation changed so visibly that everyone present understood something had shifted. They are real. They happened. The noise they made in their own time was considerable, and the noise they make in retrospect is considerable, and they deserve the attention they receive. But what endures is often quieter than what was loudest, and it endures precisely because of that quietness. Because it was the kind of thing that continued while the battles were happening, that was there before the battles and was still there after them, that did not require any particular political situation to keep existing because it had long since become the condition of existence rather than an artifact of it. The law endured. Justinian's Corpus Juris Civili, that vast codification project of the 6th century, the 50 volumes of the Digest and the Practical Institutes, and the accumulated legislation of the Code, did not simply survive the centuries, it traveled. The manuscripts that carried it moved westward through the channels by which Byzantine learning moved into the Latin world, and in the 11th and 12th centuries, when the university at Bologna began teaching law, it taught from these texts. The legal vocabulary that emerged from that teaching, refined and argued over and elaborated through the medieval and early modern centuries, is still present in the legal systems of continental Europe, in the civil law tradition that governs the majority of the world's legal jurisdictions. The categories, the distinctions, the framework for thinking about property and contract and obligation, much of this traces a line through many transformations to a commission of lawyers working in Constantinople in the 530s, under an emperor who had been born a peasant in the Balkans and died in the city he had transformed. This is the kind of endurance that does not announce itself. It is simply there in the structure of things, the way the foundation of a building is there, invisible from the outside, discoverable only by those who look for it, present whether or not anyone is looking. The Church endured. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople did not end the Orthodox Church. Mehmed II, with the practical intelligence of a ruler who understood that governing a large and diverse population required something more than military control, established the Patriarch of Constantinople as the leader of the Orthodox Christian community within the Ottoman Empire, the ethnarch, the people's leader, responsible to the Sultan for the community's order and responsible to the Church for its faith. The Patriarchate that had been the center of Byzantine religious life continued in a changed political context, governing a community that now lived under Ottoman sovereignty but maintained its liturgical tradition, its theology, its calendar, its specific way of inhabiting the year through the cycle of fasts and feasts, and the readings that accompanied them. The Orthodox faith that Theodosius IV had made the Roman Empire's official religion, that the iconoclast controversy had refined through a century of conflict, that the hesychast controversy had deepened into a specific theology of divine light and human participation in the divine life. This faith did not end in 1453, it moved. It expanded northward into the Slavic world that Byzantine missionaries had reached in the 9th century, into the Russian principalities that had received baptism through Vladimir of Kiev and the marriage alliance with Basil II's dynasty. Moscow, in the years after 1453, began to develop its own understanding of what the fall of Constantinople meant and what responsibility it conferred. The idea, elaborated over the following century, of Moscow as the Third Rome, the continuation of what Constantinople had been, the guardian of the true faith in a world where the first Rome had submitted to the Pope and the second Rome had fallen to the Turk. Whether this self-understanding was historically accurate is a separate question from whether it was historically consequential. It was consequential. The Russian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Serbian and Bulgarian and Romanian Orthodox churches, all of them are daughters of the Byzantine ecclesiastical tradition, carrying in their liturgy and their theology and the specific quality of their interior spaces the inheritance of a civilization that ended, in political terms, in the 15th century and has not ended in any other terms since. In the mid-morning, in a room somewhere in the city's older districts, a lamplighter was finishing his rounds. The rounds had begun before dawn, in the coldest part of the night, moving through the streets with the quiet efficiency of work that has been done so many times it requires no decision-making, only presence, the presence of hands that know what they are doing, feet that know the route. Now, with the morning well established and the daylight doing the work that the lamps had done through the dark hours, the rounds had reversed, not lighting but attending, checking, trimming the wicks that had burned through the night so that they would be ready for the next evening, clearing the accumulated char that a burned wick accumulates and that, left untended, produces a thicker, darker flame than the lamp was designed for. He worked at a lamp mounted near the corner of a building, at the intersection of two streets that were now carrying the morning's ordinary traffic. People moving with the purposefulness of people who have somewhere to be, carts with goods for the market districts, a dog investigating the base of the opposite wall with the methodical attention that dogs bring to walls. The lamplighter did not particularly watch any of this. He watched the wick. The tool for trimming was small, a pair of snips with a small cup at one end to catch the trimmed char before it fell into the lamp's oil reservoir. He had used this tool, or one like it, for years. The motion was a small one, precise, the snips positioned carefully and then closed, the char falling into the cup, the wick left clean and straight and ready. He checked the oil level. The lamp would not need filling today. He moved on to the next lamp. The morning continued around him, indifferent and fully occupied with its own business. The trimmed wick stood straight in the reservoir, ready for the evening that was still hours away, ready to do again what it had been doing since the city learned that darkness was a problem and flame was the answer to it. The Greek language endured. Not unchanged, nothing endures unchanged, but continuous, the thread unbroken. The Greek of the New Testament had become the Greek of the Byzantine Church and the Byzantine Chancery, which had become the Greek of the scholarly manuscripts that moved into Italy in the hands of Byzantine scholars who came west before and after 1453, bringing with them the texts they had spent their professional lives with. The Italian humanists who received these manuscripts, who learned Greek from Byzantine teachers who had arrived in Florence and Venice and Rome, were receiving the classical tradition, Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, Homer, through the hands of people who had been reading it continuously in the original language for 1,000 years, while Western Europe had largely been reading it in Latin translation or not at all. The Renaissance, which is the name given to the European intellectual and artistic flowering of the 14th through 16th centuries, had many causes and many origins and no single point of beginning. But among its causes, and not a minor one, was the arrival of Byzantine scholarship in Italy, the texts and the teachers together, the manuscripts and the people who could read them, a tradition of engagement with the classical world that had never been interrupted the way it had been interrupted in the West. The Greek learning that the Macedonian emperors had organized into encyclopedias in the 9th and 10th centuries, that Constantine VII had commissioned scholars to preserve, that the Paleologan scholars had continued to copy and comment on and argue about. This learning arrived in the Italian cities at the moment when those cities were ready to receive it, and what they made of it changed the course of European intellectual history. This is the longest reach of Byzantium's endurance, longer than the law, longer than the church, longer in some ways than the city itself. The books. What the walls kept for 1,000 years was not only the city. They kept time, the time of an idea, the time of a way of being in the world, the time of a civilization that had decided it was the continuation of Rome and the guardian of the faith and the center of the civilized world, and that held to these beliefs through the centuries in which they were fully accurate, and through the centuries in which they were less accurate, and through the centuries in which they were the faith of a small city-state surrounded by enemies, held not because they were accurate, but because they were the self-understanding that made continued existence possible, that gave the people inside the walls a reason to keep repairing the walls and manning the towers and teaching the children the Greek that was the language of the law and the liturgy and the accumulated thought of 1,000 years. The bells that marked the hours, that had been marking them since the early centuries of the city's Christian life, through the iconoclast controversies and the Arab sieges and the Bulgarian campaigns and the Latin occupation and the long Palaiologos decline, those bells did not stop in 1453. They rang in different contexts, under different authority, for different reasons. The city continued. The bells continued. The empire that the bells had measured is gone in the sense that political entities end. The throne was not occupied. The dynasty was not continued. The purple ceased to be distributed to the appropriate fingers. It is not gone in the ways that matter more than that. In the law, in the faith, in the books, in the specific quality of a liturgy sung in a stone interior to people who have come in from a world that does not always make sense, to stand in a space that has been making the same claim about light and divinity for as long as anyone can trace the claim backward. A civilization that lasts 11 centuries leaves marks that 11 more centuries have not erased. The stone is old. The walls stand, or most of them. The bells, somewhere, continue their patient marking of the hours, the way bells do in cities that have been cities long enough to understand that the hours need marking, not because the hours cannot be trusted to pass on their own, but because the marking of them is itself the point, the declaration that the city is here, that the people in it are here, that the day is being observed with the attention it deserves. The water moves against the stone pilings in the dark. The current in the Bosphorus runs south as it has always run. The city breathes. Chapter 11. The Long Quiet. The water is still moving. It has been moving through the night, through all the nights before this one, through the centuries that preceded the nights you will ever know anything about. The current runs south through the narrow channel between the two shores, steady and unhurried, touching the stone of the old pilings and moving on, the way water always moves on, without remainder, without accumulation, taking nothing with it and leaving the stone exactly as it was, only slightly smoother, only infinitesimally more worn, the change too small for any single passing to measure. The bells have gone quiet. The last of the evening's bells rang some time ago, carrying across the water the way bells carry across water, further than they would carry across land, the sound traveling the surface with a clarity that feels almost deliberate, as if the water were built for this purpose, as if this were one of the things it was for. The sound has gone now. Where sounds go when they finish is not a question that needs answering tonight. They go into the air that received them. The air is still. The city is very old. Not every stone of it is old. Cities renew themselves constantly, pulling down and rebuilding, layering new surface over old foundations. The visible face of a city always younger than the ground it stands on. But the ground is old. The peninsula has been inhabited for so long that the occupation has become geological, has become part of what the place is rather than something that was done to it. The walls that stand on the landward side have repaired and re-repaired themselves across the centuries like a living thing, each generation of hands adding its course of stone to what the previous generation left, the joins between them visible only to those who know to look. The city has been many things. It has been called many names. It has been governed by many kinds of authority, has been entered through its gates by many kinds of people, has held inside its walls many languages and many faiths and many centuries of ordinary life. The morning bread, the evening lamp, the child learning what the child needs to learn, the old person at rest, the particular piece of a room at the end of a long day that went more or less as days go. All of this is still here, in the way that things that have happened are still here, not visible, not loud, but present in the structure of the place, in the specific way the streets angle toward the water, in the thickness of the old walls, in the quality of the light at certain hours on certain surfaces that is not quite like the light anywhere else. There is no need to hold any of it. The water will continue moving whether or not it is attended to. The stone will continue standing. The bells will ring again in the morning. They always ring in the morning, in cities that have been cities long enough to know that mornings need marking, and before that for some hours the air will be quiet. The body is heavy now, not uncomfortably so. The weight of a body that has carried its day and set it down, that has nothing more it is required to do before morning, that can simply be where it is, in the dark, in the warmth, while the water moves somewhere a very long distance away against stones it has been moving against for a very long time. The old city rests. The current runs south. The air through the window, if there is a window, if there is air, moves very slowly across the hand that is resting on the sheet, and is cool, and is... The journey is complete. Rest well.